It's not particularly pleasant work to scan the vast landscape of aggression shown by political characters, but it's important work. And Institute for Energy Research head Thomas Pyle has done the heavy lifting of compiling the top 150 Biden administration attacks on oil and gas production and put them into chronological order for his organization. Here for MRC-TV, I've taken time to follow up on my first report and condense Biden year 2 into the second top 10 list of attacks. Hi everyone, I'm Gardner Goldsmith for MRC-TV, and here's our chance to spread the word and remember the key lesson. Political control over the peaceful sale and use of energy is immoral and unconstitutional. The very ideas of a Department of Energy or a Department of Labor are poison to liberty and human betterment. Now, let's pick up where we left off in part 1 at the close of 2021. Here's number 1 for our second list. On November 17th, 2021, quote, HUG's CAP leverages the Community Development Block Grant to advance environmental justice efforts. And Biden calls on FTC, that's the Federal Trade Commission, to probe anti-consumer behavior by energy companies. Here's number 2. On November 19th, the White House and Congress let loose the Build Back Better bill. Quote, Biden endorsed several oil and gas provisions in the Build Back Better bill, including a new tax on methane of up to $1,500 per ton, prohibiting energy production in the Arctic and offshore leasing on the Outer Continental Shelf, OCS, in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Eastern Gulf of Mexico planning areas. He increased fees and royalties for onshore and offshore oil and gas production, imposed a new $8 billion tax on companies that produce, process, transmit, or store oil and natural gas starting in 2023. He limited the ability of energy producers to claim tax credits for upfront and royalty payments in foreign countries, amounting to a tax increase on domestic energy producers, and imposed a 16.4-cent tax on each barrel of crude oil, up from 9.7 cents, a $13 billion tax increase on oil production. Number 3, on December 14th, 2021, quote, the EPA launched a revamp of its Office of Civil Rights to add so-called environmental justice enforcement as a key pillar in enforcing Title VI civil rights complaints. The agency's announcements mean social justice claims against, among others, the oil and gas industry will increase costs and penalties that have specious connections to its environmental mission. 4. On December 21st, 2021, we see Biden's crew set about the first part of a two-phase shift of the proverbial regulatory gears, anticipating leftist California moves to clamp down on engines, which would have a secondary effect in the market because California's auto market is so big. Now, this phase in December of 2021 merely revokes previous Trump administration rules regarding air quality and engines. The next change will come via the EPA in March of 2022. Quote, Biden's Department of Transportation issued its final rule revoking Trump-era actions which prevented California from arbitrarily becoming the national standard for fuel emissions. The rule set the stage for the administration to reinstate California's waiver. And since automakers do not make different cars for different states, the rule would allow California's radical environmental policies to reach nationwide, forcing people nationwide to pay for vehicles meeting California's standards. Number 5. On December 30th, 2021, at a time when few Americans were paying attention to the news because it was the holidays, the Biden administration announced new, more stringent so-called standards for auto emissions nationwide, again making manufacturers incur more expenses, increasing costs for consumers. Quote, Biden's EPA issued its final rule for increased fuel efficiency standards. According to the final rule, these standards are the strongest vehicle emission standards ever established for the light-duty vehicle sector. The rule, in responding to comments, claims energy security benefits to the U.S. from decreased exposure to volatile world oil prices, suggesting that decreasing oil and gas production in the U.S. will result in less exposure to the international oil and gas market because they will be disincentivizing vehicles that use oil and gas. The rule also claims that it will result in fuel savings entirely due to less use of fuel. Well, those calculations, they should be made by consumers, shouldn't they? Based on our own myriad interests and not dictated to us by politicians threatening us and the automakers. Let's get to number 6. On February 21st, 2021, quote, the Biden administration paused working all new oil and gas leases on federal land in response to a judge blocking their arbitrary use of social costs of carbon, unnecessarily hurting domestic oil and gas production. And number 7. On March 9th, 2022, the second part of the California stratagem regarding automobiles is implemented, finishing the move started a little bit earlier. Quote, EPA reinstates California emissions waiver. The EPA reinstated California's emissions waivers, allowing the state to set its own greenhouse gas emissions standards which will likely be adopted nationwide and are due to make vehicles more expensive. The practical effect is that California is setting policy for people in all the other states despite their terrible record of energy expense inflation. And number 8, on April 15th, 2022, quote, Biden announced 144,000 acres of the federal mineral estate open for oil and gas leasing, just 0.00589% of the 2.46 billion acres the American people own. Find that in the Constitution. The White House press secretary Jen Psaki said, quote, today's action was the result of a court injunction that we continue to appeal, and it's not in line with the president's policy, which is to ban additional leasing. The administration announced it would resume leasing, but with a royalty rate almost 50% higher, and Biden administration reinstatement of M37039, the Bureau of Land Management's authority to address impacts of its land use authorizations through mitigation, the Interior Department, well, they reversed a Trump administration decision which limited the scope of compensatory mitigation the department could force upon projects on federal land as a condition of receiving a permit, which will hit energy and mining projects especially hard. Under the new guidance, opponents in the federal government could require mitigation located far from the project with little relevance, effectively giving bureaucrats a blank check to request whatever they wish of a permit seeker with little controls. That's great. So they respond to the court by doing a tiny smidgen of the land, and then they make it more expensive to actually engage in anything on that tiny smidgen of land. Nice. Here's number 9, April 25th, 2022, quote, Biden reverses Trump's Alaska oil plan. The Biden administration released a management plan for the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, an Indiana-sized area reserved for oil and gas leasing. The final decision reverses a Trump-era plan that had opened most of the reserve to oil and gas leasing and withdraws some of the most prospective oil and gas areas from consideration. And number 10, May 18th, 2022, quote, The Biden administration announced they were canceling a lease of over 1 million acres in the Cook Inlet in Alaska. At the same time, the Biden administration announced they were canceling a lease sale in the Gulf of Mexico. And how about a bonus Biden black mark? Here's number 11. On August 16th and 17th, 2022, quote, President Biden signs the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, wink wink, which includes new taxes on natural gas extraction and methane leaks, and Superfund taxes on crude oil and its related products, and an extension of biofuel tax credits, and a new tax credit for sustainable aviation fuel. These biofuel tax credits will encourage existing petroleum refining capacity to convert to biofuels, making it harder for Americans to get the petroleum fuel products they need for transportation and home heating. These incentives will make the United States import more petroleum products from countries with additional capacity, such as China and the Middle East, while committing more agricultural products to fuel rather than food. Regarding the IRA, the law also encourages states to adopt California's plan to phase out gas-powered vehicles by 2035. On August 17, 2022, a federal judge reinstated a moratorium on coal leasing from federal lands that had been implemented during the Obama administration and was lifted under President Donald Trump. The ruling from U.S. District Judge Brian Morris requires government officials to conduct a new environmental review prior to resuming coal sales from federal lands. According to the judge, the government's previous review of the program had not adequately considered the impacts of climate change from coal's greenhouse gas emissions, among other effects. So, as all of the added costs and taxes and regulations and impositions and the steering of our tax cash sees the green cronies of various political forces receive our hard-earned money and makes it harder for us to live, we can remember these moves and we can tell our friends. And we can beware of further attacks because they're coming, contrary to the U.S. Constitution and contrary to our rights. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Hope you found this interesting. Again, thank you to Mr. Pyle for putting together this list. Please visit us at Rumble, where they don't censor us. We're back on YouTube rolling along, but it's always rather sketchy over there. We have to be very careful. If you are on YouTube, remember to double check that you are subscribed. Sometimes people get dropped off. Again, we prefer Rumble because they don't censor us over there, and we've seen a lot more people shifting over. We really appreciate that. Of course, please visit MRCTV.org. That's MRCTV.org to find out what the whole team is doing. And while you're there, check out the MRC Store and consider contributing to the Media Research Center. You can find us on Facebook, on TikTok, on Instagram, and on Twitter. And on Twitter, I'm at Gard Goldsmith. And on Gab, I'm at Gardner Goldsmith. For MRC TV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith.